Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to walk us through the steps of creating a top-down action RPG in GameMaker. It's very similar to an old school regular Nintendo Zelda game where we're going to have top-down maps and the player is going to control a character and that character is going to move around on a map, fight enemies and collect items and then exit the map, loading new maps, going into dungeons, and things like that. So where we're going to start with this project is by creating a quick level. We're going to learn how to do some tile maps. Since it wouldn't make any sense for us to start programming a player until we have some kind of level to walk around in. So let's start by making a new project. So I'm going to go to New Project, a blank template, and I'm going to call this project ARPG for Action RPG _ Advanced Game Design. And it is already being saved on my location on my desktop, but if it's choosing a location that you don't want, use this folder icon to change it to somewhere where you can find it. GameMaker projects do work pretty well off of flash drives. I would still recommend a USB 3.0 flash drive, but I've had a lot of good experience even off of a 2.0 with GameMaker projects. So we're going to click Let's Go, and we're inside of our project. Now, we are going to jump pretty quickly into editing the room. So let's start importing some sprites that we're going to turn into tile sets. Sorry, my cats are wanting to join the video here. All right. So under sprites, right click that and go to create sprite. The naming prefix for sprites is usually SPR _ whatever we want to call this. So I'm going to start with a grassland type of tile set. So I'm going to call this grassland. And there's actually two of them that I'm going to use. So I'm going to call this grassland 1 because then I'm going to have a grassland 2. So SPR _ grassland 1. Then we're going to go to import. And I've already have it jumping to my assets for this project. And we're inside of the subfolder for tile sets. Now, I haven't had a chance to work through all of these, so in the initial set, these may not be ready. But what we want is a 64 by 64 size tile for the tile set. We really want to be consistent. So, I mean, you could pick a 128 by 128, but I think that would be too large for us to work with. A lot of tile sets end up getting designed for stuff like Unity or Unreal Engine, and those engines have a very easy way to scale them down depending on whatever size they are. But GameMaker tends to want to work with tile sets that are consistent sizes. So I want a 64 by 64 tile set. And you can even see that this one under here is called _GM. And that's actually because I inserted a blank row, and you'll see why in a moment. So I want this one, 64 by 64 GM. So I hit open, tell it okay. And I don't need to change the origin or anything. I can leave it as its defaults. Now, a few things I will mention. We don't want to paint trees using a tile set. We'll actually turn the trees into separate objects and place them manually. All right, so that's our first tile set. Let's go and load the second one. So we're going to open it. We're going to create a new sprite, and we're going to call this SPR _ grassland 2. And I have another set. A slightly different style. So this is under Grassland Alternate. And again, we want this 64 by 64 GameMaker. And we have this here. So we can close that. Now we want to go to tile sets. Right click, create tile set. The prefix for tile sets is usually TS underscore. So I'm going to do TS underscore grassland 1. And then you have the settings here for how to slice it up. But that's not going to be very useful until we actually have a tile set to see what this is doing. So let's go to select the sprite. And I want to select grassland 1. I mean, you can adjust the size if you can't read what they are. So, or just select from the side. Now, you can clearly see that this is not an ideal slicing. You're not going to want to paint at that small of a level. And the file name even kind of told us what sizes are. This is a 64 by 64 tile. So when we change those settings, we can see that this grid is lining up correctly. Also indicating why I have this blank row, you'll notice that there's not a square here. It actually deletes the top left tile and turns it into the eraser tile. So you don't want to have any tiles in that top left. It won't get used. You could have tiles immediately following it, but it's for me to convert just a generic tile set. It's easier just to add a whole row. All right. You'll also notice the difficulty with trees and stumps, that this is a 64 by 64 tile set, but the tree, you really shouldn't paint the tree with a tile set. Again, some engines like Unity will be able to like have different sized tiles in a tile set. And so a sprite sheet like this is kind of set up for an engine that can have different sizing of tiles. We're going to just take the tree, crop it out of the image, and turn it into just a separate file altogether. And then load that and place them manually. Okay, so let's go make the other tile set. So tile set, TS underscore grassland 2. Press enter. And we're going to pick the other grassland this time. And same settings, 64 by 64. By keeping all of our tile sets the same, we can actually mix and match tiles off of each tile set. It is an incredible headache to try to use tiles from different sets that are different sizes. And you'll even notice that these are designed like this seems like an unnatural cutting, but that's so that you could have any number of length tiles. These are tessellating. I think tessellating is the term. Tessellating tiles. Repeating? I don't know. And then you can have the corner tile, etc., etc. You'll see when we start painting these. All right, 2 tiles. Pretty happy with these. So I'm going to X out of this. I don't need to change any more settings on those. And now I'm going to go to the room. And it's currently called room 1. When we figure out what we're doing, we might rename it a little bit. But what we want to do is try to design an overworld map, basically. You don't want to make it too big, but let's say hypothetically, if I'm going to draw an MS Paint, that I'm going to have like some kind of, I don't know how to draw trees, like a forest down here. So we'll just shade it like this. This is forest. Maybe I want to have a river that's kind of cutting up through here and bending through there. Maybe I want to have a mountain ridge up here, kind of an impassable terrain to keep the player out. Maybe I'll put a cave right here so I can put a little dungeon. Maybe a wall of trees to keep the player from going back that way. But you might benefit from designing an overworld map, or you could just build it as we go in GameMaker. But the thought process is, if we have a giant map, we're going to slice it up into levels. This might be room 1. This down here might be room 2. then maybe we'll allow the player to go over here. Maybe there's some kind of quest that'll take them over there. This would be called room 3, and so on. And this cave right here, that will just like take us to a whole nother like map that isn't part of the overworld. And it will just warp us to some other level called Cave 1, maybe, something. So the idea is that we're going to have transitions off of a stage where a player could just walk off here and they'll appear right here in room 3. Or maybe the player is going to walk off down here and they'll appear right there in room 2. So we're going to have a type of transition where when the player just walks off the edge of a level, it will load the adjacent tile. And then also we're going to have a type of transition, which is more of like a teleporter. When they walk into this cave that's just in the side of the mountain, it's just going to warp them to like, maybe the entrance to the cave is going to put them right here. I mean, there's no real rhyme or reason to where I put them, but maybe the spawn point for the player is going to be right there. So we're going to have like this teleporter type transition. So we're going to have 2 different types of transitions off of the stages in order for us to kind of build our level. So I'm going to design room 1, and then off camera, I will eventually design some of my other rooms. For now, we're pretty safe just to be working on room 1, but you should be thinking about putting together at least like 3 other, maybe a total of 4 overworld maps and like 1 or 2 cave maps. All right, so let's go make that happen. So I'm going to go to room 1, and we're greeted with this screen here. Well, what I want to actually do is make each one of my tiles a square. Even though many screens are rectangular, you know, like widescreen tends to be a rectangular view, and this is even a rectangle. We are going to implement camera follow. So each map can be bigger than what we'll render on the screen. So the room size is not related to the rendering size. We're actually going to start using viewports in cameras for that. And then we'll be able to follow. You can even see when we look at the viewport, it already has some built-in stuff for following specific objects. So we'll be able to follow the player. But we'll come to that when we get to there. So the size that I want, and I did a little bit of math ahead of time, is 1,920. This ends up creating a 30 by 30 size tile. It is kind of big. So if that is a little too big for you, bearing in mind that the player is going to be, well, the player is going to be about 64 by 64. So this is a 30 long. Let's see, how big is my grid? Oops. So if I set the grid to be 64 by 64, we'll get an idea. So the player occupies one of these squares. So this is 30 by 30 grid units. So again, you can play around with that number. Multiples of 10 or 15 work pretty well. So just take 20 times 64 to get your new room size. This is just 30 times 64. And again, the screen's going to follow the player, so it's okay that, you know, monitors aren't perfect squares. It's fine. We'll be only viewing a smaller section of this screen, and the camera will follow the player. Now, to put the tile sets to use, this is a pretty important part and does require a little bit of planning ahead. So there are tile layers. So if I wanted to create a tile layer, this allows me to start using a tile map. Let's make this grid. I kind of wish the grid would stay. Oh, that's right. It's going to adapt to the tile map. So once you've created this new tile layer, that we then select the tile map that we want, either over here on the right or down here. both those places will select the tile set. So let's choose our tile set. I'm going to choose Grassland 1. You can see the grid updated. And there's the eraser tile that I was talking about that takes over that top space. And here's my whole tile set. Click and drag the middle mouse to go kind of take a look around on it. You can also use the scroll wheel, horizontal scroll if you have it. Or just click and drag, middle mouse. Control mouse wheel will zoom out on it so you can see more. All right, so I want to rename this off of tiles 1. Not the greatest name. So just double click it. And I'm going to call this ground. And the ground layer, so it's kind of important to point out a few things about how this tile set's set up. You'll notice that things like the bridge actually have transparency on them. So you don't want to paint the bridge as actually part of the ground layer. So if you have water, for instance, let's just say I have a chunk of water, and I want to put a bridge across it. Well, notice that if I start putting the bridge here, it creates this transparent, well, it just erases the water and puts bridge on it. And that's not what we want. So we would actually want a separate layer for things that have transparency like this. So I usually call that layer details. Well, let's pick the tile set. So I'm going to choose the same tile set and call this details. And going back to ground, so you need to be very cognizant of which layer you're currently editing. So if I put some water back down, and maybe I have some ground over here, then if I go to the details layer, when I put the bridge on it, we can see that it uses the transparency to actually correctly show the tiles that were underneath it. So keep that in mind as you're designing your level. I would, again, caution against tile painting signs, poles. You could probably get away doing the fence. Anything the player can go behind, like, for example, the player could possibly walk behind this pole, so it would actually make more sense as an object rather than a tile. These are going to be a little bit of a special exception, these cave entrances. We're going to turn those into objects as well, but you could paint them, even though the player's head should be underneath this as they walk into it. And again, I wouldn't paint the tree. You could probably paint the tree stump because the player won't be behind it. So let that kind of be your guide. Don't use the tile map for anything the player can go behind. Like, the player could go behind the sign, so we wouldn't want to paint the sign. So what I would start with ground is painting in just basic green and then replacing it as we go. Now you'll notice that this is actually a very tedious process if I'm going to fill every square with green. So we can speed that up by going over to brushes. So inside of brushes, we could make a bigger green brush. We could actually make like road brushes. We can make a lot of different things to make our lives easier. So turn on editing mode. And if we want to just make a 4x4 giant painter of green, we could do that. Maybe I want to make a road. So maybe I'll make a little road piece. Maybe I'll make another one for that. So you could make as many brushes as you want, whatever makes the design process easier. So then turn off editing mode when you're ready to use them. And then you just click the brush, and now I can fill in this 16 times faster. Look at that. Done. Well, almost. There we go, done. So I've got my map with a basic layout just kind of painted there. If I wanted to start throwing parts of a road, I could put some road here. Maybe I wanted to turn a little bit here. Maybe the road bends here. So at this point, you would just, and then you can also touch up and add some of these other details after you've painted with the brush. You don't have to use the brush as it is. Now, for this one, you notice that's not the correct corner. We've got these inner corners. And so what we can do is kind of just paint some general amount of curvy road. You can get a little bit creative. You don't have to constrain yourself to how the brushes work. But I suppose it is worth trying to be slightly consistent in the thickness of the road. I'm planning on mountaining off the top here. So I could start putting mountains, but I'd want to put those mountains on the detail layer, because if you look, the mountain actually utilizes transparency right here. So we would want the mountains to be their own separate thing. So I could start putting mountains, and there's like the inside mountain piece. So try to use a little bit of random variation, knowing my mountains are not perfect. It's the same tile with a little bit of shading on it. The trees will help obscure some of the, I guess, repetitiveness of this. Players won't notice that because the camera is going to be pretty zoomed in on this, so they won't really be spending a lot of time thinking about that. Anyway, so you kind of get the idea. I will put my cave entrance here. So I will have a cave painted on right here, because I will plan to make that my extra cave, and then we could put a river. We want to put a little bit of challenging terrain for the player. So with this, like I said, I wouldn't do the trees. I would do the trees as objects, and we can use those to block off areas. But design a stage, kind kind of get some variety of terrain, we're going to revisit the idea of placing some trees. Well, I guess I could probably do that real quick. All right. So, ooh, this might be a problem here. I might have to make my road turn sooner. But one thing that a mistake that I might have been making, this river should have been painted on the ground layer. And so there really isn't an easy way to copy and paste that aside from just going to ground and doing my best to paint out what I wanted. Because if I want to put a bridge over this, the bridge is going to go on the detail layer. So if I wanted to put this here, notice that unless I've got those edges, it's going to cut through and we're going to see that ground there. So we got to go back to ground and you make sure. Now, I could haphazardly just leave this stuff on the detail layer and kind of let my river be like this, but it would be better practice to actually go through and make sure that my river is correct. Doesn't really take that much time. And then, honestly, on my details layer, I would actually erase that. Oops. See, again, you gotta watch out which layer you have selected. Now, I don't think you can write on it if it's hidden. So, I'm gonna erase this. Because the detail layer should really only be things that are on top of other things. Which includes the mountains, because as you can see, they have that little bit of transparency on the bottom there. Now, it is worth mentioning that you can only have one tile map per tile layer. So if I wanted to include details from the other tile set that I created, I could create a new layer here, give it some kind of name. And I could choose the other grassland. And these ones don't really go super well together. As you can see, it's a different shade of green and all that. But you could maybe steal the pit. So maybe we want to put just a giant hole in the ground. So right here, the road was... So you can have some terrain features to block off areas. That's one of the reasons why we were using the same size tiles, so that when we paint these tiles, we could use them interchangeably. And since this used transparency, it just blended to whatever color was there. You could even put this pit in the water. We could use this ash if we wanted to. So with these two tile sets, you should be able to kind of tap into your creativity and design a tile set. In the next video, we will explore putting trees in. So I would hold off on putting any trees on your maps. We will look at doing what would be called doodads. Trees, stumps, barrels, signs. We'll do those in the next video. Then after that, we'll actually start setting up the player so the player can walk around in this area. So thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the first video, and I'm excited to make a top-down action RPG over the course of this series.